Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A motion to postpone the bill indefinitely.
It has been moved and seconded to postpone and gross substitute Senate Bill 6346 indefinitely. Remarks, Representative Couture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Of course, as you know, we have roughly around a little over 3 days left in the legislative session here. And I would like to postpone this income tax bill indefinitely and reconsider it in a future session. Just to highlight a few of the reasons why, we received over 100-page striker, which is what we will be debating tonight on Friday, and we had less than 24 hours to conceive of, read that amendment, conceive of amendments, and then after that, 48 hours to draft those amendments until today, where we had, just hours to essentially look at all of the amendments and consider what we were going to do on the bill. And Mr. Speaker, short sessions are for supplemental budgets. They're for small tweaks. They're 60 days long. There was even a point in our history where we didn't have short sessions. But now we do, and we're considering now this generational seismic shift in tax policy, erasing over 90 years of precedents. And that's not what short sessions are for, Mr. Speaker. We shouldn't be doing it at all, but we shouldn't be doing it at the very end of the short session. And I will just say that a tax policy this large should not be considered, it should be considered at a later point, especially as I believe that it's unconstitutional, takes away the rights of the people to referendum, and will essentially be like arson on our economy. Please vote with me. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, rising in support of the amendment. Mr. Speaker, I just want to have a discussion with you that the underlying bill doesn't make most of the investments that you've just heard of, but circling back to the amendment itself and why it's important that the Coalition decision language is put into this bill is important. Justice Holcomb wrote in his concurrence in the Colton decision that income is either property or nobody owns it. And that is the fundamental thing about this amendment that is important to understand. Because in the state of Washington, unlike other states where they have separated property and income, because of our state's constitution that says property is everything, tangible or intangible, subject to ownership. That means that everything that you own is your property. And in the underlying bill, it purports that if you don't own your property, then who does? Mr. Speaker, the government owns your property. The government owns your income. The government owns the fruits of your labor, and it could be spent on whatever the government wants to spend it on. That is exactly the reason the Coalition decision eliminated the fact of having a progressive income tax in our state's constitution by simply reading our state's constitution. And talking about reading, Mr. Speaker, permission to read?
Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's often said that, one of the reasons we need a progressive income tax, like the one being proposed here, is because, we want to fund all of the important things, and we want to make sure that we have all of the money in the world that we're ripping out of our economy in order to make sure that we have a social safety net and good schools and all of the good things, which essentially we could do because we have the highest revenues in state history at this very moment that continue to grow and grow and grow. But Justice Holcomb actually writes about this in the Colton decision, and he essentially says, it is better that we suffer the inconvenience of the present loss of such revenues than that we disregard the emphatic restrictions of the Constitution for the sake of temporary relief. It may be possible to frame an income tax law which will assess all incomes uniformly and comply with our Constitution, which of course is not now before us, and we need not consider it, and we need not consider this one because this one's not uniform either.
Member from the 35th District, Representative Couture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Rising in support of the amendment. Last I checked, we did have a three-legged stool of taxes in our state: the B&O tax, the sales tax, and the property tax. It served our state well, especially over the last 10 years when we've seen on average 6.9% revenue growth year by year, on average every single year for the last 10 years. We don't have a revenue problem in our state, Mr. Speaker. We have a spending problem. But despite that, we're now getting an income tax, another fourth leg to the stool, exposing us, and that's exactly why this amendment is important, because it talks about the volatility. And despite the fact that, North Dakota, as was mentioned, actually is an income tax state. But when we look at states like Florida, who are receiving 500 taxpayers on average per day, are not income tax states, while we're losing roughly 48 to 50 taxpayers per day before the implementation of such an income tax. But what I'll say, Mr. Speaker, that it's not just the income tax. This is just the straw that's going to break the camel's back. It's capital gains, it's B&O on gross sales that don't account for all of your expenses or your payroll. It's high sales taxes. It's the cumulative effect of all the taxes and regulations, and by the way, the high crime rates that we have here in our state that are chasing companies, which we are one of the best in the world. In Washington State, we have companies like Costco and Amazon and Microsoft and so many others, but instead what we're already seeing is the capital flight just at the threat of this last tax, where we have companies like Boeing moving their operations to the Carolinas, and we have companies like Starbucks moving their operations to Nashville, Tennessee, Mr. Speaker, and then we have tons of people getting laid off at Amazon in the thousands and thousands and thousands, and meanwhile we're trying to achieve parity with another income tax state, California, that already has Silicon Valley crushing our startups, crushing our tech industry, and we have this golden goose here, Mr. Speaker, and that's why it's important we talk about this volatility, because if we don't adopt this amendment and understand that this is going to increase our volatility, and it absolutely will, and understand the capital flight that we're going to have, we're not going to have any more jobs, we're not going to have any more businesses as they all go away because of an income tax and reckless spending that this legislature couldn't control.
Representative Couture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Unfortunately, rising in opposition to this intent section amendment, because as I think we've maybe talked about a little bit earlier, that these intent section amendments aren't really truly binding. And if it's the idea that we have to have intent section language to talk about what the policy objectives are of the underlying bill, then I don't actually believe that this is going to be relief for low-income or middle-income families or small businesses, which also I represent. I believe this intent section amendment, unfortunately, although well-intentioned, is a pie-crust promise. A pie-crust promise because, Mr. Speaker, what will happen is that in the next predictable budget situation, the next predictable budget deficit, this $1 million threshold, which isn't even really $1 million, will be ratcheted down to the rest of us. That's exactly what happens when you give government the power to tax income. It learns it and it never, ever gives it back. And every single year that we see reckless spending and another predictable budget deficit, it will be ratcheted down again and again and again. And so, Mr. Speaker, what we will have in oncoming amendments at some point, maybe around lunchtime tomorrow, is amendments that actually give you and me a chance to deliver the tax relief that is promised in this amendment, instead of intending to do so why don't we just actually do so in those future amendments? Please vote no.
Representative Couture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Rising in support of the amendment, I think of restaurants in my district right now that are struggling or even just struggling not to close their doors. One of the common things that I hear from my constituents is, hey, would you like to go eat out tonight? And the common answer is, wow, just too expensive. I mean, I went to a Mexican restaurant with my wife, and it was like over $100 just for the two of us. It's pretty difficult. And like has been mentioned, those costs really are hard to bear for our restaurants as well, because, you know, they're trying to get customers in the door. They're trying to survive. So getting rid of some of the tax on prepared foods is, one, helpful to the families, but also helpful to the businesses as well. And I remember not too long ago, Mr. Speaker, you could go to McDonald's and get a McChicken off of the dollar menu. I'm not afraid to admit that. I maybe did that oftentimes when I was in the Navy. The dollar menu doesn't even exist anymore, Mr. Speaker. As a matter of fact, a McChicken is 3 times that amount now, and if you buy another one, you get one for another extra $1, so it's actually 4 times the amount if you just want to, or twice the amount if you just want to get 2 McChickens. I mean, we got 6-piece chicken McNugget meal for $5.79, McChicken for $3.10, double cheeseburger for $4.19, fries for $2.50. It's too expensive, and Mr. Speaker, I grew up with not that much money. You know what dollars mean in a low-income family's world? It means calories. Dollars to calories ratio. That matters. That matters to people. This amendment isn't just about, eliminating some sales tax on prepared food. It's about food security itself. It's about the security of our small businesses, our brick and mortar restaurants and bars, much like the High Steel Beer restaurant in Shelton, who is asking the community's help just to stay afloat. And we talk about $1 billion. I mean, that's exactly what the governor promised in tax relief. And then we just earlier adopted an intent section amendment that said we're going to help low and middle income people with tax relief. Well, here you go. Let's adopt it right now and actually put theory to practice and actually follow through with the intent that we just adopted.
The good member from the 35th, Representative Couture.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Rising in support of the amendment. You know, this was the largest regressive tax increase in state history, this one tax that is the subject of this amendment, the sales tax increase. And I just want to build off a little bit of something that the good member from the 7th District was talking about. It becomes clear later that live demonstrations, as we encroach upon October of last year, that live demonstrations are now sales taxable to many people in our state. Throwing the rug out from under people who do pottery classes and gardening classes. And I'm sure there's some attorneys here who might have to now be sales taxed for their continuing education. And not just attorneys, but also doctors as well. We're going to tax them for literally the privilege of learning and continuing to sharpen the tools of their trade. But you can go down the list. But I always thought the most absolutely absurd of the live demonstrations was to tax kids trying to learn how to drive in driver's ed. That's absolutely insane, and I just think that we need to completely go back, and of course this amendment touches other things other than live demonstrations as well, like the pie-crust promise of the tax on digital advertising, which I'm sure we'll talk about here at some point later, where it was like, whoops, last session, whoops, we didn't mean to accidentally tax digital advertising the way that we did. We'll fix that. Well, we didn't fix it, Madam Speaker. And now it's like, well, if you want to be able to fix that, digital advertisers, you got to go find some offsetting cuts. But here we are raising a $4 billion income tax that's completely unconstitutional and is going to apply to everyone else in no time. The least we could do is keep our promises the promise that we weren't supposed to do that in the first place on digital advertisers, and like, let's stop taxing the driver's ed of kids, and let's stop taxing gardening classes and pottery classes and the continuing education of doctors and lawyers. Please vote yes.
Representative Couture.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Unfortunately, also asking for a yes. I think that this amendment, although good, underscores how sloppy the 109-page striker really is written. As you may well know, Madam Speaker, the federal tax code is over 70,000 pages. This thing is like 100 pages. What could go wrong? Vote yes.
Representative Couture.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. You know, I'm not a CPA, but do own a small business, and I definitely agree with some of the comments that were made, especially from the gentleman from the 19th about pass-through entities. And what I'm not excited about, Madam Speaker, is some tax advisory group set forth in this bill in the Department of Revenue, who's already kind of bungled the largest tax increases in state history from just a session ago, and really pulled the rug out and confused all of our businesses and all of our taxpayers as early as last October, when a lot of it went into effect, and even some after that. And I think that tossing all of our duties to write these things into the bill to align it with the federal tax code is really just throwing it all onto the state agency, which is, well, frankly, what we're doing, because the bill assumes 230 new FTEs for the Department of Revenue, $150 million just to implement, and then we're going to cross our fingers and hope for the best that some tax advisory group who is essentially appointed by a party that has one-party rule for the last 40 years to do all of the right things in the federal tax code. I'll just move on and say that I don't want to put all of that on the Department of Revenue. We should write it into this bill with this amendment. We should support this amendment to make sure that we have some certainty for the pass-through entities. And I don't think it's going backwards to have carry forward and carry back. That's actually, the bill itself is going backwards almost 100 years of precedent. I think that this is an important thing to have for certainty for our business if we're going to have it at all. Madam Speaker, please vote yes with me on this amendment.
Representative Couture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hope you join me in voting yes to adopt this amendment. This amendment is pretty simple. It says that essentially you would need to see revenue decline over 2 fiscal years by the Nonpartisan Economic Revenue Forecast Council. Now, that seems pretty simple, and it is, but I think that on top of asking for two fiscal years of declining revenue in the ERFC for this amendment to prove that, it also creates predictability for many of our businesses, our small businesses, our entrepreneurs, our startups, our people, our taxpayers, especially when people like you and me are paying this tax later on down the road. Mr. Speaker, not only the predictability that this amendment would bring, but also the fact that it would be triggered by something nonpartisan, the fantastic state economists that we work with. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I think it's worth touching upon, that for the last 10 years, year after year, we've averaged 6.9% increase in revenue, year over year for the last 10 years. We don't have a revenue problem like I continue to hear during this debate, that if we don't have an income tax, then we won't be able to fund schools, we won't be able to fund health care, we won't be able to fund playgrounds and whatever else it may be. We have a record budget, Mr. Speaker. We have a record amount of revenue never, ever, ever seen before in the state of Washington. That's how much revenue we have. We have tons of revenue, and it keeps growing and growing. And even though in the last couple years, the revenue has slowed a little bit since the pandemic, it still continues to grow. And we still continue, especially after the largest tax increases in state history last session, continue to see more revenue. And as a matter of fact, in the last Economic Revenue Forecast Council meeting, revenue was up again, mostly on the backs of our business after we've collected massive amounts of B&O taxes on them. And I think that why we need this amendment is also to point out that what we're actually dealing with is reckless, runaway spending here in Olympia and in our budget. And until we get that in order, there's no such thing as an income tax that's going to fix all of the things that we need to fund. We need priorities of government, just like Gary Locke introduced way back in the day, and we need to prioritize our most essential functions of government before wasting it on waste, fraud, and abuse. Vote yes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Rising in support of the amendment, please vote yes. I think that when we're talking about whatever the underlying bill or the striking amendment or this amendment does for the problem of double taxation on the bordering communities between Oregon or Idaho and our state, I think what's important to realize that the best way to fix it other than adopting this amendment is to just not pass an income tax at all. And I keep hearing about what this income tax is going to fund and help some of those people on the border communities that are going to be essentially double taxed in many ways, especially later on down the road when this whole tax is ratcheted down to apply to the rest of us. And I keep hearing about free school lunches. Well, Mr. Speaker, let me just unmask that claim for you. The free school lunches is in the intent section of the striking amendment. That means there's no guarantee, that means it's not binding, and that means the only thing that kids are going to be eating at school is pie crust. Vote yes.
Member from the 35th District, Representative Couture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to say, well, first of all, rising in support of the amendment, hope you join me. I think Medicaid is really important, especially in some of our areas where we have, you know, in my district, we have critical access hospitals, and I know we've talked about a little bit about that this session. But the system is struggling, not just our providers and our doctors, but also our hospitals themselves. And I want to talk a little bit about the numbers behind the amendment. It says 25%, and there was kind of a comment made that, you know, who knows if that's the right amount. Well, Mr. Speaker, if you're essentially, when it's fully enacted, raising a $4 billion tax, 25% of that is $1 billion. So that's enough to basically restore the $1 billion cut from Medicaid in this biennium after this budget, supplemental budget, which would then be just a hair over $1 billion cut from Medicaid. But then do something that the good member from the 9th District was talking about earlier, and that is start to catch up ground over those 18 years of negligence over not, adequately increasing reimbursement rates in Medicaid. And what exactly happens, Mr. Speaker, is that the $1 billion is the mixture between the state cuts that were made in the biennium plus the resulting loss in federal match funds. And so every time you cut a Medicaid dollar, you lose federal match funds. Sometimes it's, roughly equal 50%, but sometimes it could be a little bit more. It just depends on the category you're talking about. But for the purpose of this conversation, let's just say it's roughly 50%. So, Mr. Speaker, what we're talking about is literally a 50% increase as a result of $1 billion state funding, which would be a quarter of the revenue of the income tax for the express purposes that the striking amendment says that the income tax is for. And so I agree with the good member from the 9th that spoke earlier about waiting 18 years to see increased reimbursements to Medicaid so that we can actually help our hospitals. Now, we did some good work this session, but look at places like Toppenish and look at places like some of our critical access hospitals that are struggling right now. This is long before H.R. 1 that this stuff was happening. We need to do a lot better, and if the bill says that we're going to use it to fund health care, then let's let's actually do that. We can actually make up ground instead of just replenishing what the legislature cut last time in this amendment. Please vote yes.
Member for the 35th, Representative Couture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to rise in support of the amendment, and I just want to thank the good lady from the 30th for having the courage to drop this amendment on this striking amendment. And I think when I actually was listening to the good member from the 2nd District, I looked at the affordability and tax relief account, and that reminded me of a similar account that I had proposed before session in a budget framework. I think that's important, although I did not need an income tax to find tax relief. I actually didn't need any taxes at all to do that. I just curbed reckless spending. But it's important to note in the amendment that when you're looking at the distribution between 51% general fund and 49% to a host of other kind of tax relief related things around individuals and childcare and small businesses, I think it's important to also note that although 51%, I might kind of blush or balk at that going to the general fund, where I believe it will most assuredly almost be wasted, that without even this 51% going to the general fund, it would actually be a lot more going to the general fund without this amendment, where for sure it would not be going to tax relief. It was talked about a little bit ago about tax relief for small businesses. I looked into the striking amendment, Mr. Speaker. It's really very small amounts. I mean, on the scale of a $4 billion income tax, the small business relief is almost a pittance. We're talking about micro businesses and side hustles basically getting a few $100s, or maybe if they're lucky a couple thousand in a year. That's not the flavor of most of our small businesses in Washington. It's almost a slap in the face to me, Mr. Speaker, that we have to raise a generational seismic tax that crushes our economy in order to provide just the tiniest little bit by volume tax relief to some, but then we're not actually going to codify any of that in the bill. And I commend the good lady from the 30th for at least trying to codify some of it in the bill, at least try to break down the percentages and try to keep the promises that many have made before the session even started or before we started debating this bill on the floor. And that's why I think it's important with the amendment to at least acknowledge that while a lot of it is going to the general fund, that a lot more will go to the general fund and not go to some of the good causes of the 49% in the amendment. Please vote yes.
Representative Couture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We also spend the general fund on laser hair removal for trans inmates, but I want to recenter it back to the amendment real quick, which is about funding our paramount duty of education. And I just want to level set this amendment for you and why it's important, Mr. Speaker, because right now we have a dwindling amount of the share of the state budget that is dedicated to education, somewhere around roughly 42%. Our state budget, our supplemental budget that was passed earlier, is a $250 million cut to K-12 after cuts that were made last session to K-12. That's what's reduced way below 50, way below 48, way below 45%. It's now at 42%. And as a matter of fact, even in the governor's proposed budget, he proposed literally raiding this exact account, which was funded by capital gains income taxes. Where have we heard that before? It's going to go to fund education. But then he proposed sweeping that account to fill up a deficit that was based on negligent budgeting. And this is why it's important, Mr. Speaker, to fund our paramount duty and our education and some of our higher ed and our child care in this education legacy trust account. Because what I believe is going to happen, Mr. Speaker, literally the second, I bet you $100 right now, the second we gavel out this session, there's going to be dozens of lawsuits for the failure to fund basic education. And that's because we're not actually making basic education our priority in the budget. It's less of a priority than a whole lot of other things. And I heard about Medicaid and some healthcare stuff. You know, it said we educate, medicate, and incarcerate. Those are our three big caseload buckets, mostly remaining flat or stagnant or sometimes even declining. And so we're actually paying more to get less. And at the same time, we're not making the adults suffer with the $3 billion pay increase to state employees. We're making the kids suffer in their school with cuts to TK, with cuts to Running Start, with cuts to LEA in the property poor districts, with cuts to bus depreciation, with cuts to federal bus depreciation. That was a bill that was just passed in appropriations this morning, and I hope we spent long enough to make sure it never sees the floor. Vote yes.
Representative Couture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Rising in support of the amendment. You know, sometimes as a small business owner here in the state of Washington myself with employees, sometimes I look at policy like this and question, why is there such a disconnect? Why not exempt some of these pass-through entities? I'm one of them. And I know, much like my wife, because we run a family-owned business and with 6 employees, that, there are certain things that happen, especially as we're in the construction industry, where you see sometimes low times of low cash flow and sometimes big spikes, depending on when the projects come and when they get completed. And sometimes they could take months and months or maybe even over a year, depending on what industry you're in, but especially the construction industry. And oftentimes you want to save for a rainy day. Not in our state, because we're going to raid the rainy day fund, but in a business you might want to save for a rainy day and put money into your reserves. Well, if you put money into your reserves, then that's going to be taxable income. And that actually creates a lot of unpredictability and risk for our small businesses when they can't store away reserves to make sure they have healthy cash flows and to make sure that they're always making sure we're covering payroll, which is the first expense that I think about every 2 weeks, Mr. Speaker, before I take care of myself, before I take care of anyone else. And that's why I think it's important that we accept this amendment and accept this. And I thought it was a little odd. I was reading yesterday from a business advocacy group that advocates for minority-owned businesses in Washington state, and they were opposing the underlying bill, this income tax. And one of the biggest reasons was because of the pass-through exemptions not really being included in the underlying bill, and this amendment would potentially solve a lot of their problems. And one of their biggest problems is that they're using using their businesses and some of this pass-through and reserves to build generational wealth for people who have disproportionately not had generational wealth in the past for them and their families. And that's why, there's a lot of minority groups, minority business advocacy groups that are opposed to this income tax because it'll hurt all of us and it'll be ratcheted down over and over again in every predictable deficit. And that's exactly why we need this amendment. Vote yes.
The good member from the 35th District, Representative Couture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Rising in support of the amendment and also in support of our troops and our veterans. I do agree with the good member from the 19th that this does send a signal that we support them, and I was shocked to learn about all of the different states from the good member of the 31st that already exempt veterans and military members. As you know, many times they might live in our state, but maybe they're not a resident of our state. That happened to me, and I'm just proud in the 35th District that I get to serve a lot of the people that work in and around Naval Base Kitsap and the Puget Sound Navy Shipyard. All of the hard workers there, including all of the sailors and the veterans that continue to live. And my district's one of the higher densely populated districts with veterans in it. And it was said, Mr. Speaker, that this won't apply to any veterans. They don't make enough money. Well, if that's the case, Mr. Speaker, then what's the problem? Let's just adopt the amendment and move on. And if we're right, or if I'm right, I should say, that it will be ratcheted down to one day apply to veterans or to veterans who then later move on and their retirement gets soaked up by an income tax, or they start a business and then they get soaked by an income tax. Well, then we've valued our veterans and we've stood up for them and we've exempted them from the income tax. So one way or another, I think this is actually just voting yes is a win-win for everybody, regardless of what you believe, Mr. Speaker. So I would urge you to vote yes.
Representative Couture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Rising in support of the amendment. You know, many years ago, my family was subject to some pretty nasty marriage penalty stuff, just on the federal side of it. And so I kind of take the fact that we have not fixed the marriage penalty and the striking amendment or the underlying bill yet, kind of personally. Of course, as it stands right now, this wouldn't have applied to me and my family, but as I personally believe that this will be ratcheted down to the rest of us later, I believe that it could. Mr. Speaker, you know that I have kids with developmental disabilities, and you know, oftentimes families that have kids with developmental disabilities need to access high-risk pool insurance for their kids, and if you make a little bit too much but not enough to cover, you know, some private plan or whatever else, you kind of get stuck in limbo. And as the federal government has a marriage penalty for those things, sometimes, you know, it's better to not get married to make sure that you can protect the health care and the needs of your own children. And I fear that someday when this gets ratcheted down, you know, those marriage penalties will hurt families like that. And second, Mr. Speaker, and I know we'll talk more about the marriage penalty coming up in future amendments, the intent section, which is not necessarily a guarantee, but I guess slightly a promise. As someone said before, it's even less than a promise. But what does it matter to have this label of tax on millionaires if we're not even able to make a basic promise in the intent section of the bill to not tax people's income below $100,000? By the time we get there, Mr. Speaker, I mean, most people in Seattle have to make over $100,000 a year just to basically survive in the state of Washington, because the cost of gas, groceries, rent, insurance, childcare, health care, you name it, is amongst the highest, most unaffordable in the entire country. And so if we're not even willing to say in the intent section that we're going to just not tax you under $100,000 ever, I don't know what kind of promise a bill called Tax on Millionaires makes, because I think it'll be a tax on the rest of us. If we're not willing to make that promise, Mr. Speaker, then that's exactly why my constituents don't trust that this will only remain on millionaires.
Representative Couture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Rising in support of the amendment. You know, I'll just tag on to what the good member from the 19th said about Article 1, Section 1. It goes on to say that all governments derive their just power from the consent of the governed. And that is what this underlying bill means to me. This striking amendment with the necessity clause, taking away the rights of the people. This is, by my account, one of the most unpopular bill in state history, as I can see it, with over 100,000 people signing in against it. And as I go around my district and hear from other people across Washington state, there's a lot of different kinds of fears, whether it be a marriage penalty or some kind of LLC, S-corp, pass-through entities. But the biggest thing I hear, Mr. Speaker, is that this income tax will never remain on millionaires, because no income tax, including our federal income taxes dating back to 1913, has ever just remained on millionaires. We're talking about bracket loops and all sorts of different things, including the ultimate slap in the face, withholding your paycheck to pay. It was said that when the federal income tax was implemented, no farmer, no business owner, and no blue-collar worker would ever pay that. Well, look where we are today. And that's exactly where I believe, and a lot of my constituents, like literally 85 to 90% of them, believe this will land on their doorstep someday too. And so it's important that we say and codify in the bill that if ever it is going to be ratcheted down below 1 million, which frankly with the marriage penalty it already is, but if we're going to do that, then it should go to a vote of the people before that happens. Without that, the title of this bill is essentially just the biggest pie-crust promise I could ever think of. A tax on millionaires today, a tax on the rest of us tomorrow. Unless we have this amendment, please vote yes.
The good member from the 35th District, Representative Couture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Rising in support of this amendment to eliminate the marriage penalty once again. A little bit different than one of the previous amendments we heard about the marriage penalty, because the last amendment included some intent section language about exempting individuals who make under $100,000. This amendment is a really clean, really common sense amendment that I thank the good member for having brought it forward to us. It's pretty simple. If you make $1 million, then you're subject to the tax. And it actually puts the bill back into alignment with itself, which is a tax on individuals, on millionaires, and not a tax on households. And so it recognizes that, if you make $1 million and you're single, then you're subject to the tax. I still don't like that, but, better to make sure that a household is not penalized if they make more than that combined. And I just think, Mr. Speaker, that, we've had laws in the tax code and laws in our country to promote the nuclear family, to promote marriage, to promote having babies, to promote the American way, to promote generational wealth. And it's bills like this and income taxes that we've seen, especially on the federal level, that run against that family structure, that run against, and we don't want people to divorce each other on paper, but more so, we don't want to penalize people for loving each other, no matter who they are, whether they be straight, gay, lesbian, or anyone else. And at the end of the day, this is one of the biggest problems that I've heard about the bill, other than the fact that it'll apply to the rest of us in no time. But we must fix this marriage penalty, and as I look at the amendment so far, this is the cleanest one that doesn't include anything else. So if you were going to fix the marriage penalty in the striking amendment in the underlying bill, this would be the one to do it. Please vote yes with me, Mr. Speaker.
Member from the 35th District, Representative Couture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Marriage is a sacrament. I do believe in that. But what's not a sacrament? Taxes, government, spending. And I'm just sad that this bill punishes love.
The member from the 35th District, Representative Couture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Permission to read?
Please proceed.
Thank you. This is, get this, from the bill. Thus, the legislature intends to limit the tax established by this act to only individuals with annual adjusted gross income of $1 million or more. Individuals, Mr. Speaker. Last I checked, when I look around my household, when I look at myself and my wife and my 4 kids, we're not all one individual, unless for some reason I'm getting the English language wrong here. But Washingtonians with an annual adjusted gross income of less than $1 million will not owe this tax. Mr. Speaker, the marriage penalty in the underlying striker means that 2 individuals, not one, not a household, but 2 individuals happening to live with each other in holy matrimony, making $500,000, are subject to this tax directly against the underlying bill. Without fixing the marriage penalty, it casts the entire bill in doubt. This amendment splits the baby from the previous amendment, which actually would have fixed this exact problem. So at least we could do is make it somewhat marginally less bad. But I don't understand, Mr. Speaker, how a plain reading of the bill itself can even be argued. How could it even be argued? It plainly states individuals and no individual making below $1 million will ever owe this tax. But we're sitting here arguing over like the last 3 or 4 amendments about this exact thing. Because it's clear as day that if you make under $1 million and you live with another person making under $1 million, but together, not as individuals, but as a household, you make over $1 million, then you're going to pay the tax. You can make 500, you can make even under this amendment over 700,000, and you pay the tax. You pay the tax. I just don't understand. Am I living in a fantasy world? Is this bizarre land? I just don't get it. I'm reading the bill, and it plainly says individuals. Please explain that to me, Mr. Speaker, and let's pass this amendment at least and make it less bad.
Remarks, Representative Couture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This amendment just requires the Department of Revenue, which frankly now under this underlying bill is becoming the new IRS, provide a notice to all employees in Washington State if the threshold of this tax changes below $1 million, which I think we already well established with the marriage penalty. It does anyway, and stating that the legislature is breaking its promise to only tax millionaires, as I read to you from the bill earlier. Mr. Speaker, this is just common sense amendment to make sure that we're notifying people if the legislature breaks its promise. We're going to ask the 230 new IRS agents at the Department of Revenue to send out letters with the $150 million our budget gives them to implement this tax, $150 million which could have been used in a host of different other ways that could have benefited our state. Maybe we could have refunded all of the cuts we made to our schools with the result of that. However, I think that at least if the legislature does inevitably, and I do mean inevitably, break its promise, probably somewhere in the 2030s at minimum, when another predictable multi-billion-dollar deficit hits once again because we haven't learned our lessons about budgeting, that we should at least send a letter to the employees of Washington State notifying them that we failed them and that now we're ratcheting this tax down again. Who knows how far it'll go, but that'll continue to go down. I think it's just basic accountability and transparency that we make sure we notify the citizens and employees of Washington State whenever this income tax threshold changes. Please vote yes.
The member from the 35th District, Representative Couture. Representative Couture, you have 1 minute and 7 seconds remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, the underlying bill asks the federal government to share data with us, which is kind of funny in another sense because we won't share data with the federal government. However, that will help create a database in which all of the people of Washington will be a part of that, just to be able to track us all and if we owe this tax or not. You know, I frankly don't see that. And I think we do need this because where have we seen the hypotheticals before? Well, the capital gains tax wasn't supposed to change, but it did. And the state tax wasn't supposed to change, but it did. And then we rated the account that the capital gains income tax was supposed to fund in the governor's proposed budget. So again, pie-crust promise after pie-crust promise. No one trusts this. No one trusts this at all. And it's not hypothetical because the legislature keeps doing it year after year after year. Please vote yes.
Further remarks. The member from the 35th District, Representative Couture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, I heard it was a giveaway, but I guess I don't understand how you can call it a giveaway if it's your own money. It's not a giveaway if it's your own money that you earned. But to just center back to the amendment, which is about, frankly, just parity between resident and non-resident athletes, pro athletes in our state who likely to make over $1 million in the NFL and the NHL and the MLB. And you know, when NBA Commissioner Adam Silver recently visited Bob Ferguson, this income tax was on the top of the list of things to talk about, along with just the general economic vitality of the greater Seattle area, and how that would look into the future, because what really matters to pro sports teams, Mr. Speaker, is ticket sales. And you know who sells tickets? Cal Raleigh sells tickets. Sam Darnold sells tickets. In the Seattle Kraken, Matty Beniers sells tickets. Star players sell tickets. So free agency actually does matter. And if you don't think that they don't look at tax structures with their millions of dollars that they can only make for a short period of time in their lives, maybe for, if they're lucky, a 10-year career, Mr. Speaker, it's very important. This is why Matthew Tkachuk, who just won gold for Team USA, moved from a high-tax area in Calgary, Canada, to Florida to win a Stanley Cup with the Florida Panthers. And one of the biggest reasons he did that, well, to be with a more competitive team and some other factors, but one of the biggest things is no income tax. And I keep hearing, well, there's other pro athletes, like let's take the Dodgers, for example. They have a big income tax. Well, the effective tax rate in Seattle is not 9.9%. It's more like 18.8% when you talk about the combined tax rate after the passage of a bill just like this. But when you look at the Dodgers in LA and whatever in California, they actually allow non-resident status for their athletes so they can get carved out of those income taxes largely. They could go claim domicile somewhere else. And so, again, Mr. Speaker, we love our sports teams here in Washington, but we got to be able to attract free agents and have this amendment for parity so that we can drive ticket sales so that we can even have them in the first place. Please vote yes.
The good member from the 35th, Representative Couture.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and good morning. I am standing strongly in favor of the amendment. You know, I just find it a little hypocritical here in the state of Washington. Ever since I got elected, I heard that there was a policy roaming around the legislature of no new felonies. I've heard that before. I'm sure maybe you've heard that before too. And I just find it hypocritical that we're going to charge a felony. And despite what the good member from the 45th said, I find some consternation with this because you know what else was always a felony? Knowing possession of illegal narcotics. But that's not a felony anymore. That's a modified gross misdemeanor. And we've had epic amounts of drug deaths in our streets. But to go back, also, it's a Class C felony to assault a worker on our Washington State ferries, but not a Class C felony to assault a social worker in a fentanyl home while they're trying to save kids. So I guess as far as the amendment is concerned, so the underlying bill and the striker wants to make it a Class C felony for evading this tax, I guess. But at the same time, we're making that, like the good member from the 12th mentioned, you know, similar to all of these other things. And it wasn't just so long ago, well, it feels like long ago, yesterday, where we just ended a community protection program for people who are sexually violent predators or who committed violent sexual acts and felonies. So we literally ended a program to protect the community from those people. Oftentimes they could have committed a felony as well. So I don't think that it's fair to go around and look at the actual criminals in our society and get rid of felonies for them, but then go and criminalize people for trying to evade getting their money stolen from the state of Washington. Please vote yes.
Remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Permission to read?
Please proceed.
This amendment requires a 10-year income tax revenue forecast be prepared by the Economic and Revenue Forecast Council, and then it requires the legislature to conduct a stabilization option review if income tax revenues decline by 2% in 2 consecutive years, and then it requires a review by the Joint Legislative Audit and Review Committee every 6 years. Mr. Speaker, happy to run this amendment for the good member from the 30th, and I just want to break down, I think, what the underlying intent of this amendment is, and that is, if we see capital flight as a result of the income tax, we need to be able to look at some metrics and study that, and then have JLARC come back to us with potentially some options. I think that given all of the context and all of the discussion that we've had here and others have had outside the building, and what we've seen with other taxes like the estate tax that we're now rolling back and things like the capital gains income tax, I think that it's a smart move by the member of the 30th and that I support to be able to study these metrics going forward using our experts at the ERFC and using the good people at the JLARC who do fantastic work, by the way, and just to make sure that if we do start to see that dipping revenue in the income tax, that we'll be able to go look back at those metrics and see if there is, in fact, some capital flight happening or maybe something else, that we'll be able to properly address those things quickly before they bite us in the rear end. Please vote yes, Mr. Speaker.
The good member from the 35th District, Representative Couture.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Once again, I didn't draft the amendment. I just moved the amendment. So I guess you or I can criticize the amendment all you want. I think that if I drafted it, I might have done it a little bit differently, but the underlying intent is still sound. That we should be trying to collect some more data. It doesn't say that once you collect the data, then something must happen. It doesn't say you collect less taxes. It doesn't say you collect more taxes either. It just says collect the data. JLARC looks at it, sends it back to the legislature. The rest of us can decide. And Mr. Speaker, I worked for a Fortune 500 as a program manager at a 64-year contract. You ever heard of that? You know, I managed 80 years of missile production. If you don't think that you can forecast something 10 years out, I got a bridge in Alaska I could sell you.
Representative Couture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Rising in support of the amendment. You know, as I said on appropriations, I love a good null and void clause. And I think when we're analyzing the amendment, I see the null and void unless there's a constitutional amendment. And I do absolutely love the words from the good member of the 7th about persuasion. This is about persuading, about generational seismic shift in tax policy and over 90 years of precedence. I think qualifies for me as an important thing to bring to the people as a constitutional amendment, Mr. Speaker. But then it goes on to say that, you know, it's going to codify the promises. That constitutional amendment should codify the promises in the bill. It doesn't say that you can't have it. Doesn't say that you can't do it. It just says that you have to ask the people first. That's my boss. I know it's your boss too. The people of Washington State. And I believe we should be asking them that. And I don't think this amendment guts the bill. All I see is asking permission from our boss, the people, if we should have an income tax in our state and do it the right way with a constitutional amendment. But without this amendment, Mr. Speaker, the underlying bill guts democracy. This underlying bill is a threat to democracy, and that's exactly why we need to pass this amendment.
The good member from the 35th District, Representative Couture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Also rising in support of this amendment and our Seattle Supersonics. You know, I do concede that it is a little bit awkward to have an amendment that basically says, hey, we're not going to do something unless we get a professional sports team in here. But at the same time, for as long as you and I have been around, and since 2008 when we lost the Seattle Supersonics, there has been an enormous outpouring of support from communities all across Washington that really, really, really want the Seattle Supersonics back. And by the way, Mr. Speaker, tons and tons of investment into the new Climate Pledge Arena in downtown Seattle and all sorts of different things to kind of set the stage for the NBA coming here. Lots of investment for the NBA to finally one day just please attract them back to us again. That's what the fans wanted. That's what the people wanted. And it's good for our economy as well. As a matter of fact, if we do attract the Sonics back, they will attract, well, million-dollar athletes. And, under the underlying bill, they'll be taxable. And maybe some of the athletes that they play against when they travel from out of state. So it's actually, good for our economy to have the NBA here, but there is concerns because at the end of the day, they need to have long-term viability of not just their stadium, but their practice facility and their sports club, over the long-term economic viability of the Seattle area. Plus, ticket sales really matter. And what they're looking at is, yes, the income tax, as was noted before, but it's not just the income tax, it's the sum accumulation of a lot of different issues, taxes, regulations, you name it, a lot of different things, including could be even crime as well. But Mr. Speaker, I think if you delay the income tax until we get this asset and new NBA team back into Seattle, it would probably put a lot of people at ease, especially considering, I don't really like the income tax anyway.
The member from the 35th, Representative Couture, and Representative Couture, you have 37 seconds remaining.
Perfect. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to note for you that one of the big reasons to do Climate Pledge Arena and rebuild Key Arena was because the NBA said they would never come back unless they did. And so we did, and we very grateful to have the Seattle Kraken and the WNBA teams and everything else that happens in the Climate Pledge Arena. Great arena, by the way, you should visit if you haven't. But that was a factor in it, and now we've built it, now we should attract the team. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I won't be serenading you. Standing in support of the amendment, I think that the good member from the 12th kind of laid the groundwork out from the amendment, and I'd like to expand on that if I can. As you know, we're talking about before the income tax is even ever implemented, our budget spends $157 million to create Washington's new IRS. With almost 230 new Department of Revenue employees to enforce a tax that, frankly, I think will just be found unconstitutional, and so it'll be $150 million down the drain. Permission to read, Mr. Speaker?
Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So when you talk about volumes of money and you think about the kind of the other things happening in our state budget, I think it's important to understand that without this amendment, which would cap it at 100 FTEs, here's the kind of money that we don't spend $157 million on in our state budget. We spend less than $150 million on forest health, on the $100 million for police that no one can access, on the community reinvestment program, and that's 4 times the amount than we gave a one-time COLA bump to the PERS TERS 1 retirees, and that's roughly about the equivalent of the foundational public health. And then also more than we gave to the Left 1 pensioners after we rated their Left 1 pension in additional benefits. So when we're talking about volumes of money, we're spending $157 million. We don't do that for a lot of other big programs, Mr. Speaker, but we're creating this force, this enforcement force, this IRS agents, essentially, for the Department of Revenue to go after what was said to be something like 21,000 possible taxpayers, a lot of which will probably already be capital flighting their way out of our state before the courts even decide it. However, I think that if you can take this amendment, Mr. Speaker, we could at least split the baby here a little bit. We could limit the amount of FTEs, because one thing I do know is that what's not on the budget and what's not on the books right now is next time CBA. And that's just going to continue to grow and grow and grow until the only thing you're spending your income tax on is a new collective bargaining agreement for all these new Department of Revenue IRS employees. Please vote yes.
From the 35th, Representative Couture.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It would be amazing just to find out who will leave first, us or the businesses in our state. I was I was listening to the talk about the B&O tax and the history behind it. You know, the court said no in 1933. That's all true. The legislature came back, passed a temporary tax, but then in 1936 and 1938, they tried an income tax. And you know what the barrier was, Madam Speaker? The voters. The voters were the barrier. They're the ones that said no. Like they've said no 11 straight times to an income tax, and if we gave them the chance, they would make it number 12. But back to this amendment, which is about B&O taxes, which I always feel like is probably one of the most unfair taxes you could possibly scheme. It's going to tax you on gross receipts. You don't get a chance to, like you do in other states with a corporate activity tax, to deduct your payroll or your expenses or anything else. So it's like one of the most regressive possible taxes. It doesn't account for any of your margins or anything else. And you see a $10 million grocery store, Madam Speaker, but they're making 1% margins. And you say, yeah, that looks great. Seattle thought about that over the last year to try to tax those grocery stores making 1% margins. But as a part of the largest tax increases in state history, we need to start rolling off these regressive taxes. If the whole purpose of a progressive scaled income tax is to have less regressive taxes, I failed to see where we did a whole lot of that. The B&O small business relief is a pittance. It's like 13% of what the governor even promised, which was small to begin with. As a matter of fact, you almost have to be a micro business or a side hustle business or a very, very tiny business, a small business under the striking amendment to really see any kind of quasi-meaningful relief. And we need to roll this off because we absolutely crushed our service industry and we crushed our manufacturing. And so when we all celebrated like a month ago or whatever it was when we had our last revenue forecast because we had a little extra revenue in the coffers, we had to crush our business in order to do that. And how long are they going to take it? They're not going to take it, and they're not going to take the accumulation of the highest B&O taxes in state history, the highest sales taxes in state history, and a $4 billion income tax that chases their job and capital out of the state over to Oregon and Idaho. Please vote yes.
Further remarks, the good member from the 35th, Representative Couture.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It is true that there's something around the order of like $300 million in new costs because of the reforms, not cuts, made in H.R. 1. I guess you could disagree with those, but they are reforms. And I think it's important to note that before the H.R. 1 reforms, we were facing multi-billion with a B dollar deficits. Like a, $15-16 billion deficit. It was really more like $7 billion deficit, but you catch my drift. It was $7 to $16 billion, depending on who you asked last session, and now it was like $4 billion this session. Madam Speaker, $300 million in costs is a small volume for the impacts of H.R. 1, which really hasn't taken effect until 2027. When we're talking about multi-billion dollar deficits that were created long before that.
The member from the 35th District, Representative Couture.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Permission to refer to my notes from time to time.
Please proceed.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. As we've discussed many times before, we don't have a revenue problem in Washington State. We have a spending problem. We have record amounts of spending, an $80 billion budget, 3 times that of inflation, over double in the last 10 years. And Madam Speaker, you've heard a lot of the reasons why and all the cuts in the budget, but this income tax bill is a mistake. Once you give the government the power to tax income, it rarely, if ever, gives that power back, Madam Speaker. And in all of the promises, the broken promises, the empty promises this bill makes, the only thing that it truly does, in my view, is begin to layer more taxes upon more taxes upon more taxes. It is just another tax on top of the largest tax increases in state history. I believe this will shatter our economy. I truly believe that, and so do my constituents. Almost 90% of them. Almost 90% of them. We don't have to wait for the bill to get signed, Madam Speaker, for the capital flight. It's already happening. We don't have to wait to see the job losses, Madam Speaker. It's already happening. Watching our biggest top corporations quiet quit, all the way to Nashville, Tennessee, all the way to the Carolinas if you're Boeing. We have some of the star companies in the world. So many people would be jealous, so many other states would be jealous of us. And we're shunning them away. And it's not just the income tax, it's the sum accumulation of everything, the taxes, the regulations, and the effect of, with no relief, no meaningful relief on top of that. Madam Speaker, you heard about progressive income taxes, and you heard about, maybe it's even been said before, that this is a tax on millionaires. No, Madam Speaker, this is a tax on everybody with the standard deduction that's in statute that could be changed at any given moment in time. In future sessions, when we run predictable multi-billion-dollar budget deficits, and we go back and say that we don't have any more time, this income tax is a failure of duty. It fails our people, it fails to preserve and protect our Constitution, and we could have done a lot better than this by just curbing reckless spending and making government live within its means. Vote no.